focus on, there are probably three reasons why I chose to make the book about resistance to policing. I think the first one is probably out of a bit of a frustration generally with wanting to learn about the history of anti-racism in Britain and being bombarded by a lot of US literature, right? People are familiar with the Malcolm X's, the Angela Davises, and so on and so forth. And I really struggled to find comparable activists and organizations in this country, right? They are, because they're out there. And obviously, more recently, they've been popularized in BBC series like Small Axe, but it was a real struggle. So I really wanted to, I really thought to myself, I want to try to do research so that the generation after me is better able to access, what Black communities are doing today. I guess the second reason was because the book emerged at a time, or the research projects emerged while I was a youth worker in Hackney in Northeast London, where I was doing some work with a lot of young people. And as I'm sure everyone is aware, in 2011, the police, there were three quite high profile deaths at the hands of the police. A reggae artist called Smiley Culture in the February of 2011, a couple of months later, a guy called Kingsley Burrell in Birmingham, and then finally, of course, in London, Mark Duggan. And it was at that time that I started to get involved in a lot of the kind of community campaigns, which were not only involved in organising protests around these three high-profile deaths, but also a lot of community defence campaigns, which was challenging the massive resurgence of violent policing, which came after the 2011 rebellions. So resisting things like raids on people's homes, arrests, instances of brutality, a lot of young people being imprisoned and that kind of stuff. And I started writing a few blogs about what was happening in Tottenham and other places where I was working, doing that kind of volunteering and that kind of stuff. And I realized there was so much stuff happening, but no one was really writing about it in a lot of detail. And I just felt like a few blogs wasn't enough. Something more in-depth needed to happen, which is why I decided to try to formalize the writing I was doing, so that I was able to turn it into a PhD, which meant I could go out and interview the people who are doing this kind of work, look at the history of it and that kind of stuff. And I guess the third and final reason why I focused on resistance, I guess, was a kind of personal reason as well. I think I'd really struggle to spend all day, every day writing about how painful and distressing and horrendous policing is. And I think for my own emotional well-being, I think writing about resistance was something that I wanted to do as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and in the book you chart a history that kind of implicates the British colonies and the foundation and development of policing. And as you kind of touched on there, I feel like that's lesser known in the UK, and people may have a greater understanding of that in US kind of contexts. Could you tell us a bit more about that history? Yeah, sure. So I guess Britain does this, and I think a lot of European countries do this thing where they like to pretend that racism is this thing that happens in America and used to happen in South Africa, but now everything's obviously fine. And when of course what this does is obscure the fact that most of the history of Britain's policing hasn't taken place on the British mainland. Right? It's taken place in its colonies in the Caribbean, across Africa, across South Asia and Southeast Asia, across Australia, other parts of the world. And this wider international British history, this imperial British history, for me, is really integral in understanding the history of British policing. But it's also really crucial about, yes, and Ireland as well, thank you, Robert. And Ireland's a really important part of the book as well, particularly for understanding policing. But what's also really important about that history for me is about how it helps us to understand the history of British anti-racism. Because rather than starting the clock with the so-called Windrush generation, what thinking about imperial and global history does is enable us to understand that Black resistance to British policing has taken place across Britain's colonies, right? It takes place across Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of Britain's empire, way before it takes place on the British mainland. So I wanted to think about those kinds of, that wider British history of not only racism, but crucially as well, anti-racism as well. Thank you. You kind of have touched on there in your opening as well about the kind of 2011 riots, as they are known. And And remarkably, somehow we're coming to 10 years since those kind of took place, and they were quite a pivotal shift in, pivotal shift in gangs policing in this country. And could you speak a bit more to how that gangs policing has taken shape over the last decade, and how, when race isn't a fixed construct, how it's been so fundamental to the continued racialization of Black communities, and as well any resistance to that gangs policing that you speak about in the book?
Yeah, sure. So without getting too academic, I found a concept for understanding gangs really useful. This concept called the moral panic, which was developed by Stuart Hall and his colleagues back in the 70s. And they apply it to this category of crime called mugging, right? We've all heard this term, mugging. And what's important about mugging is that mugging isn't really a crime, right? There's nothing in the law books, statute books about mugging. Mugging is a category of crime, right? So a category of crime is, if you have like a new category of crime, like mugging, for instance, which is introduced in Britain in the 70s, or gang crime, which is kind of popularized in the 21st century. What it does is it kind of vacuums up loads of existing criminal offences, right? Robbery, theft, assaults, those kinds of things, into this new category of crime, creating the impression that there is a new problem, that there is a different problem. And that new and different problem can be attributed to a new and different people, right? And that new and different people, in the case of both mugging and gang crime, are young Black men predominantly. And this serves a really important purpose for the state or for government, because what Stuart Hall and his colleagues say is that, like, capitalism, like our economic system, is crisis-ridden, right? There are always these crises where you have low levels of employment, you have people in precarious jobs, you have people's pensions under threat, and this is a big issue in the 1970s, and it's an even bigger issue, I would say, today with the moral panic around gangs. Right? Not only is there this economic crisis leading on from the financial crash of 2007, 2008, but there is a housing crisis. Right? There is a looming ecological crisis. There are all these different crises which our governments isn't capable or willing to deal with effectively. So what they do is they can create or magnify a different crisis, a crisis of law and order, a crisis of morality, right? A migrant crisis. And it's that crisis that they deal with, so that people who are angry about their jobs and their pensions and their housing and all of the quite real material crises that come out of capitalism, that is seen as not being the real crisis that's being faced in this country. The real crisis is the crisis of migration, the crisis of immigrants. The real crisis is the crisis of law and order, of criminality, of gangs. And so by dealing with this apparent crisis of law and order, the government is able to better, I guess, reinforce its own legitimacy, right? Because in the eyes of people, they're not able to deal with the economic problems they're facing, but the government is legitimate because they're providing security, they're providing order, right? Security at our borders, order on our streets. And so I think that's why gangs, this moral panic around the gang, is so crucial. The other thing that's really crucial about it is that it rationalizes or justifies the expansion of police and prison power. Right? Not only does it help to justify the massive expansion in our prison population, which has almost doubled in the last 30 years, but also the expansion of police powers, right? From surveillance and monitoring people to injunctions being curbing people's civil liberties, but also the militarization of police, right? More armed officers, more different kind of weapons such as tasers and spit hoods and those types of things. And so we're seeing a range of different organizations and campaigns attempting to resist this kind of policing of the gang, whether it be youth organizations which are developing non-police alternatives to addressing serious youth violence, which of course is an issue in lower income communities, from Brixton and Moss Side to Glasgow and St Paul's. But we're also seeing it in the kinds of campaigning against policing itself, right? So challenges to policing schools, like organisations like Kids of Colour and Northern Police Monitoring Project are engaged in, but also the forms of surveillance which are imposed upon suspected so-called gang affiliates, where we see organisations like Tottenham Rights campaigning against that as well. So we're seeing a really interesting, quite broad range of campaign groups challenging this type of gangs policing, both youth-led and campaign and kind of legal advocacy as well.
Thank you. And I think, unless it's already been put in the chat, a shout out to two Manchester-based academics here as well, Patrick Williams and Becky Clark, whose work around gangs, joint enterprise and gangs databases is so important. So it'd be great if those can go in the chat as well. And Adam, I know you've spoken to their work as well, if you wanted to reflect any more on that.
Yeah, so Patrick and Becky's work in Manchester has been really integral to everyone, including myself, I think, better understanding the gangs matrix and demonstrate. And the gangs matrix is basically what it's called in London, but a series of gangs databases where the police collect all of the people that they identify as being involved in a gang and monitor them, can impose kinds of injunctions upon them, which prevent them from going to certain places, speaking to certain people, using social media. If they're an artist or musician, it can prevent them from performing or recording their music. It's been used to prevent young people from attending further education colleges, or for their families getting housing through housing associations, criminalizing people in a whole wave of different means. But also, as Becky Clark and Patrick Williams have pointed out in their research alongside a great community organisation called JENGBA, it's also enabled the police and the court system to use a legal doctrine called joint enterprise, which enables them to incarcerate a large number of young people for committing one singular criminal offence, even if only one person has been found guilty of carrying out that particular offence. So it's really escalated the expansion of long custodial sentences for young people, particularly Black and Asian young people. Yeah, Patrick and Rebecca's work has been really crucial, not only for understanding the expansion of gangs policing, but also crucially equipping community organisations like JENGBA, Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association, and others with the kind of tools necessary to resist this kind of policing more effectively as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I believe there was an article in The Guardian yesterday that was kind of a follow-up from the case here in Manchester, where 11 young people have gone to prison, Black young people, Black and mixed young people, for one murder, which again brings back Patrick and Becky's work too. Adam, in the book you talk about the futures of Black resistance and specifically abolition, which is a term we've obviously heard a lot more of in the past year following the murder of George Floyd. Interested in how you use that term, and what is your vision of the types of movements we need to build change and to achieve abolition?
So for me, I think the language of abolitionism, and maybe Asad can talk about this in a bit more detail as well, for me that is how a 21st century generation of anti-racist activists is articulating a revolutionary vision. Right? In the 70s and 80s, the Black Power movement talked about global revolution. And I think that's unsurprising, because global revolution was taking place in the 1970s, right? You had anti-colonial movements in parts of Mozambique and Angola. You had the Cold War raging. So you had these global revolutionary movements in parts of Latin America and elsewhere. And global revolution seemed like was a distinct and real possibility, I would say, during that period. I think now it feels more difficult to pick out the places that are leading global revolutionary movements in the way you could in the 1970s. But we do have that's also different today is, as I mentioned before, this massive expansion in police and prison power, right? A far bigger prison population than we had in the 1970s, a far more sophisticated and expansive border regime than we had in the 1970s and 80s as well. And I think people are therefore articulating their revolutionary visions in resistance to this expansion in police and prison power. And of course, what abolitionism for many people means, or maybe I can talk from my own perspective, is a vision in a world in which police, prisons, and the border system are obsolete. Right? So the question, of course, is how do we get to that? How do we get closer to that vision? And the way in which we get closer to that vision is by recognizing the fact that despite this massive expansion in police and prison power over the last 30 or 40 years, there has not been a comparable or a requisite reduction in violence in our society. There's not been the kind of improvement in public safety that prison and police expansion tells us will follow from these kinds of changes to the penal system. And what it also identifies is the fact that most societies where there is lower levels of harm or violence aren't the societies which have greater levels of police and prison power. They're societies that have higher levels of equality. And you can think this about communities as well. The wealthier suburbs where there is less policing and less violent crime aren't the places where there are police officers in every corner. They're the communities where people have stable jobs and stable housing and access to mental health provision and all of the other kinds of fundamental building blocks of life that people need in order to live a safe and prosperous existence. And so what abolitionism argues isn't to release everyone from prison tomorrow and sack every police officer the next day. What it's arguing is that we need to reduce society's reliance on the police and prison system, both for practical reasons, because it's not making us safer, and for moral reasons, because it's actually bringing more violence and harm into our communities very often. And invest in community-led alternatives to the police and prison system that can prevent people from harm and violence, whether that be youth services or mental health provision or services for people with domestic violence or survivors of child abuse or secure housing and access to further and higher education, all of the types of things that people need in order to live a safe and relatively harm-free existence. And so it's about thinking about, and I think this is really crucial, how it incorporates community organizations and initiatives, which often might not necessarily consider themselves to be part of an anti-policing project, or maybe on the peripheries of such a form of activism, as understanding these kinds of projects as being the center of anti-police activism, as youth projects and mental health provision and domestic violence services and renters unions and trade unions are as integral to anti-police activism as the kind of more confrontational protest that we might generally associate with these kinds of struggles. And understanding abolitionism is both about building as well as dismantling, I think for me is really fundamental to this kind of quite radical vision.
Thank you, Adam. I'm going to open more broadly up to the panel now. Asad, you were chair of Newham Monitoring Project. So, firstly, I'll come to you and ask if you can tell us more about that work and that resistance and the importance of police monitoring groups to community resistance, and perhaps what successful monitoring groups look like and need. I guess there might be people on here that want to build some and create some, but it'd be great to hear about your work there.
Thank you, Roxy, and great to be able to join you all. And it's a great book, and I absolutely, I'll do a plug for Adam. If you haven't read his book, it's great. And I do think it's a really important thing to do, which is to tell the story of our own Black resistance, right? Because we have an incredibly rich history of resistance in this country. In fact, it's the story of our communities. In every single town and city, it's the story of Black resistance, which has been both about racist violence and policing. Now, we could go all the way back, as Adam said, and talk, in the 50s and 60s. But I just want to maybe just concentrate on that period from the 70s to 80s, where you see this explosion of monitoring organizations. And to say, of course, in the 70s, we have this, we have the rise of the far right. They're on the streets, obviously, communities under attack all around the country. We have the state violence in terms of the police and either turning a blind eye to the far right or colluding with the far right, as we saw countless times in protecting the far right as they marched through Black areas in pretty much every city in the country. And there was an incredible sort of resistance at that time. I mean, people often think about, oh well, that was the time of the Anti-Nazi League, and it is true. There was a big popular movement, the Anti-Nazi League, but also there was huge amount of Black self-organization going on as well. communities organizing, saying the state is failing us, we have to protect ourselves, we have to protect our own communities. And you see this incredible sort of explosion, and the Small Axe film does a little bit and shines a spotlight on some parts, but you've got Black People's Alliance, you've got Black Unity and Freedom Party, you've got so many incredible different organizations all being set up. And all of those organizations constantly were saying, look, we keep coming together after every single murder that takes place, or we keep coming together when people in our community are being arrested by the state or by the police, and that's both from immigration to racism to policing. We need to have something that is actually there for our community. And this idea came of, well, we're going to set up monitoring organizations. It sort of drew a little bit of, I don't want to always look to the US, but it drew some of its thinking from the US, of the idea of the Panthers that, you need to serve your community, you needed the law book in one hand, you needed to understand the law, and then you also need to organize in terms of your community. But it also drew a lot from our anti-colonial traditions, because many of the people who were at the forefront of setting up those came from organizing in our countries of origin, right? They came from Black organizations, trade union groups, they came from workers' associations, and when they came here, they reproduced many of those organizations. And in Newham's particular example, we'd had a long spate of racist murders, lots of different, violent arrests by the police. On this particular Saturday afternoon, on the main high street, a young Pakistani man was stabbed to death in a busy street for a £5 bet by racists who could kill the first Paki, right? That was the thing. And hundreds of young people, Asian and African Caribbean, marched to the police station saying, we're sick of this, we want accountability. And of course, there was a huge sort of police response to that. And out of that, people said, we're going to set up our own organization, and the monitoring project was born. And initially the idea was, we're just going to try and collate the extent of the racist violence and the incidents that are happening. It quickly got so overwhelmed. It set up a 24-hour emergency service. It trained volunteers. It said that the state would fail, so we would intervene. And so we had a tier of volunteers that if you rang in the middle of the night, people would go to your house. If you were being arrested, there would be people there. If you were under attack, there would be people coming. And of course, at the same time, you would also be, harassing the authorities to intervene. And the idea was, again, you take each case and you campaign on it to tell the story of what the structural injustices that exist. And you tell, and so this radical vision that we had was always based in terms of the idea of, it's only by community organizing do we actually build both our power and deepen our understanding and analysis, and actually become an effective weapon against the state. Just before this, I was just looking at all my NMP stuff, and I was just reminded that slogan we used in the 80s: "Who are the criminals? The police are the criminals." And it was the chant at every single protest that Black community held, because they understood the policing that was being they were subject to. We talked about it at the time as public order policing. We talked about it in terms of, that we wanted policing by consent and police accountability. But that was all about challenging this idea of the notion of the state and police power and its relationship to the Black community. And, through countless defense campaigns, countless murder campaigns, and just every day hundreds of community campaigns around individual cases, Newham became a really incredible place of this idea of a radical challenge to the state. I mean, so much so that the Metropolitan Police called NMP the most sinister, damaging, and divisive organization in operation. And we know now at the Spy Cops that they try to infiltrate all of the monitoring groups and all of the self-defense campaigns that existed. But there's I think for many of the monitoring groups, of course, they were for a period of time and a moment of how our community was organizing. And I suppose now I'm just really heartened by this new wave of abolitionists, of people retaking and thinking back of what was successful. How did we connect with our community? How do we deepen people's political understanding, join the dots, but also how we campaign, both at a local level, but then amplify that at a national level. And, we've done a huge amount of toolkits, and in fact we're going, you know, with Netpol, like how do you set up monitoring groups? And I know it's really great that the Northern Project is there, because you might tell from my accent, I'm originally from Lancashire myself, lived in Manchester, and you know, there was a time when we didn't have many monitoring groups, but what we did have was a lot of different ecology of infrastructure. It was the Liverpool 8 Law Centre, it was, you know, law centres, community organisations, all of them shared an understanding of the nature of policing, shared experiences, rallied together, supported each other, both in solidarity, but also when one community was under attack. All of the different network of organizations would provide resources, capacity, their experience, amplified platforms to tell the stories. And of course, those were days without social media. And so it was very, very important for our community to know what was going on. You know, I grew up in Burnley, where we were being firebombed and had set up an Asian youth movement, you know, and I didn't know that in Bradford, you know, 12 young people had been arrested for making firebombs, petrol bombs, to defend their community from a march of the National Front. Yet that's what we were doing in Lancashire, in all of these small towns. And it was only when we started to create this infrastructure of grassroots organizations and movements did we start to like learn also of what was successful, how we ran campaigns. So, you know, I think one of the legacies of NMP and that whole period of Southall Monitoring Group, NMP, Gakara, all of these around the country was this understanding that we can never win against the state, even in the court, even within the judicial system. Yes, we can have the best lawyers. Yes, we can have all. It's only when we mobilize our community that you change the balance of power. Only when you change the balance of power do we begin to see a different outcome in those individual cases, but also the long sea change. And of course, that ultimately resulted in the Lawrence inquiry and the recognition of institutional racism, which of course had been a long-standing call by Black activists for like decades.
Thank you, Asad. And do you feel like you've seen the role and the shape of monitoring projects change quite significantly to kind of continue resistance against policing? Because I think it's something that we reflect on at NPMP in terms of how, you know, we maybe not be doing those kind of activities and on-street monitoring that was done in the early days before we as members ran NPMP, and how that's had to shift quite a lot thinking about kind of data profiling and new and emerging kind of policing. Have you kind of seen that shift in what resistance looks like on the ground? And I think that's important, of course.
Sure, and you know, and even in NMP's whatever 35-year history, you know, we were constantly evolving. We were never stuck. We were always constantly analysing how racism and state violence was being put forward. We started off with we're around, you know, came together around racist violence. Then we moved in terms of police violence, and that led us into deaths in custody, which led us into actually understanding, you know, the miscarriages of justice, and you know, and bit by bit, what everybody was doing was starting to actually look at the judicial system as a whole, and then start to look at the state as a whole, and both connect their struggle here and with movements that were all around the world as well. I mean, that was also a great feature of that period, where people were making contact. Of course, it was slightly harder and more difficult, but people were making contact with, you know, Aboriginal communities and about deaths in custody and sharing experiences. We were making contact with, you know, movements in the US, exchanging ideas about, you know, what was Black organizing look like in the 90s, different to what it looked like in the 70s. What was state violence look like now? And of course, you know, we all know now, you know, we're living in a much more surveillance state where the power of the state is even greater. The spaces that we had to organize have largely been, you know, sort of destroyed, right? The community infrastructure that we relied on for building our power was obliterated, and it was a conscious decision. If you look back at what Margaret Thatcher talks about in the 80s, was, you know, how do you challenge this Black radicalism? And they saw and said, we have to turn these community organizations into service organizations. We have to do away with this infrastructure that they rely on. And you see local authorities beginning to shift away and depoliticize lots of different of the resources that the community had. So I think nothing is ever static. We're constantly fighting the same fight, but it's in very, very different guises. And I think, you know, this now, I would say, it's actually much harder. right? I mean, I lived through the 70s and 80s and of organising, and yes, we were burying way more people, and we had horrific racist murders and racist attacks. But the violence was, the flip side of the violence was also that we had incredible power within our community, and that the community had this understanding, and you could rely on, you made a call in the afternoon, you'd have 500 people outside a police station because everybody understood an injury to one is an injury to all. Really this sense of an interconnected community. And that, as neoliberalism has deliberately destroyed that, right? I mean, and that's, the economic system has changed that. And so our spaces for organising have also changed as well. So absolutely, there's no need now for an emergency service, right, in the way that the monetary groups ran it, you know, in the 80s and 90s. But there is a need for our communities to really understand everything from the gangs matrix, how pernicious the system now is, and how do you get criminalized. And it's not simply being criminalized in the way that we would talk about it, as Adam talked about, you know, this idea of moral panic about mugging and gangs and Asian gang and black gang. It's in such a different way that it actually, you know, the same tools don't necessarily apply, but the same analysis does apply. I think that's where I would say, you know, our political analysis hasn't changed. Our tools about how we respond do change.
Thank you so much. And yeah, as you touched on, kind of drawing from international links as well, I believe we have Andrea, who joined the call, who I just want to give a shout out to, who's been so fundamental to supporting our work here for Police Free Schools, who does the same work in the US. So yeah, thank you very much for being here. Zara, in the opening of the book, Adam kind of reflects on youth work and conversations about policing with young people that highlighted kind of a shared experience and a solidarity amongst young people. And you've obviously been working in the community for 10 years with young people from over police communities. And it'd be great to hear about your work in that area and your experiences of the importance of youth work in the resistance to policing.
Hi everyone, great to be here. Yeah, it's funny that you start off with this bit actually, because when I read the book, which I just finished this week because of the sun, it perfectly captured what has kind of, it resonated so deeply because it picked up what we as youth workers think about and kind of talk about within our circles, but when it comes within the statutory services that we're threaded in between, what we're saying and what we're feeling gets lost. And a lot of the young people that we work with are demonized and, you know, criminalized by these services, and they're written off as young people who can't handle their emotions and can't have conversations around things, but actually they see clearer than most people because their eyes are open to the injustice that exists in the estates that they live on, and they have seen trauma within their lives. We've seen trauma from the adults that surround us, and then reach a certain age where that trauma is now we're on the receiving end of. And this is what the young people consistently say, and they have no release for these emotions in safe spaces, which Asad's just been talking about. These safe spaces have now been stripped away from communities. Youth workers have been stripped away from communities, community centres, family units have been decimated by the justice system because people have been picked off and pulled away. Licence conditions prevent people from going home when they are finally released from jail. And to work in Manchester with these young people, as somebody who was once a young person there myself, it's distressing how little has changed from when I was a young person all those years ago. The same conversations that I was having with the people around me are the ones that I'm now facilitating with young people. And we talk about a world without state violence, and the young people can envision that so strongly. They can envision what it looks like and feels like to be safe. And it's not about me going in with answers, because that's not what I'm there for. I'm just there to make space, and they own the space, and they speak to us about the wrongdoings that they're faced with each day. And when we talk about youth work as a sector, we've seen how violently it has been reduced. You know, we are non-existent. We've been stripped back into centres, community-based youth work that I'm still lucky enough to be a part of. I mean, I don't even have an office. We're literally live a nomadic existence based on the estates. There's probably maybe 2 teams on the side of the city that I work off that exist like this now, when 20 years ago, these were community run groups. They were members of the community that lived on the estates, that grew up with your mums and your dads and your brothers and your sisters. And they knew you when there was this understanding of the situations, which has now been swallowed up. And I honestly see my role as a youth worker in the true sense is enacting, is being resistant. You know, resistant comes in many forms. We hear about direct action and protest, and we see various different protest groups that chain themselves to trees, you know, to stop the building of HS2. But resistant also exists in enabling young people to access their power, to know their rights around policing and the criminal justice system, to having access to legal representation that will act in a way that is best for them rather than the state. It is acting as a go-between and a liaison between the school and the statutory services that work to involve themselves in their life. Safeguarding policy has become, you know, as much as it's necessary to safeguard young people, it has become so intrusive. And it strips away rights from young people in the name of a policy, and it interlinks services in a manner that is extremely dangerous and violent. No longer can a young person act as a young person. In many ways, we've seen that with Prevent. You know, we've seen that young people are criminalised for having siblings who have been involved in something, you know, and now they sit in child in need panels or various different kind of panels where so many people come and they sit apart and they pull everything to pieces and they skew information to fit a narrative that has been created by somebody else around them. And in Manchester, we see the gangs database and the collation of information that exists. And when you actually look at the statistics, serious youth violence for the most part in the city is majoritarily white males, but the data that's held is majoritarily black males, you know, and what does that say for how the system is working? And when we look at the upcoming plans for policing in schools, I mean, this is information that many parents and community members weren't even privy to. They didn't know about it until Kids of Colour and Northern Police Monitoring Project released the report. And furthermore, for those who aren't online, it hadn't reached them. Youth workers act as that communication tool between upcoming policy implementation because of the mailing lists that we sit on, and community members at the forefront. And it's sad to think that each year that it's stripped back and stripped back. And as these safe spaces are facilitating conversation and exploring their lives and their power and supporting them to access their power and act in a way that is constructive, is stripped away, we see that young people, like any human being, can act in a way that is then not, it can be criminalized, like shall we say, you know, everybody has emotions and everybody acts in a certain way, and when there isn't a space for people to express themselves, that emotion can come out in a way that is deemed criminal. And we see this knock-on effect constantly. And when we talk about support services, you know, mental health services that have been stripped back, youth workers now have more than one job. They fill so many voids, and it's about bridging the gap between all of these services that, although do exist, don't really exist. When we have 2-year waiting lists for mental health services, the mental health service doesn't exist. By the time a young person can reach the stage of that referral where it's accessible, they've aged out and have got to go to the back of an adult's waiting list. And so when we think about safety of young people, and the criminalisation of young people, and we think that we're part of a welfare state. Well, the welfare state doesn't exist, and the police defend the fact that it doesn't exist. And I think when we work so closely with families, it's so apparent. I mean, it was so apparent for me as a child growing up, you know, the daughter of a refugee, the granddaughter of a refugee, that the barriers that presented themselves in my life were institutional. They were created. It wasn't that the family that surrounded me didn't want the best for me. It was that the barriers that existed were put there by the state. So as these barriers get stronger and stronger year on year, they get bigger and bigger. And the thing is for many people, as they take the batterings that we take, the ability and the strength to continue to fight the system weathers. You know, we hear about the weathering of racism, and when you've been battered generation after generation from your arrival in the country post-war to what you have now, where you've been stripped, how is there any fight left? And so to have the support mechanism stripped back of youth workers and community-led initiatives, like Asad said, it's literally been facilitated to end up in this place that we find ourselves in now. And all that being said, we have some beautiful experiences, you know, day to day in work, and we see some amazing young people flourish and finding their path and reaching some real success. But the road is really hard, and I think many of the young people that I work with now talk about not even having children themselves. And, you know, how sad is it to think that, you know, you're about to enter the world of work and you're like, yeah, this isn't a safe place for me to live in. Why would I bring another life here? And at 18, 20, 16, sometimes as young as 14, they've already written off the future for themselves, but also for the next generation. So, yeah, it's difficult in Manchester at the moment, but I think it's really important that the people that continue to work in the roles of youth work are really steadfast in their resolve and dedication to local community members and centering the young people and their families in the work that they do. Because community members will often, and this is what I think is so funny about social policy implementation, is that they hold these big consultations with people and have policy designers in place so far removed from the people who the policy is going to affect. When you go onto these estates and you talk to us, we often have the solutions that would save people millions of pounds, but they don't want to listen to what we're saying because it means allowing us to live in a safe environment where we have access to real human rights and infrastructures that don't work against us. So yeah, that's what we're up to at the moment with Youth Work in Manchester.
Thank you, Zara, and I'm so grateful for your work here as well. I'm really glad that you brought up just the challenges of multi-agency working as well. And, you know, we can resist policing, but it's so hard to sit in those child in need meetings or with whatever other agency and realise they're also the police and they're also playing that role in policing. And I wonder if you wanted to speak to any more on just that challenge of wanting to build gaps, but bridge gaps with certain services, but also recognising they have a significant role in policing young people as well, particularly Black young people.
I think this is the difficult thing, is that a lot of these services are there for the good. They were created with good in mind, so to speak, you know, and young people 100% need safeguarding in many ways. There are, and I know and have worked with some amazing social workers and even youth offending workers, you know, we've got long-standing relationship with the local YOS teams who go above and beyond kind of their call in many instances to prevent young people from being breached and understanding the circumstances that exist around the young person. That being said, there are instances when safeguarding and the paperwork that sits alongside it in the administration of safeguarding can really hinder the safeguarding of an actual young person. Because data monitoring, for instance, you know, when you record as a youth worker, I will be privy to conversations with young people that are constructive in the sense that they're sharing what's going on in the local estates. Now, safeguarding has to be taken seriously, and we need to report where children are at harm, at risk of harm, or are potentially going to cause harm to others. But to be reporting, for instance, that people are smoking weed on the local park every Friday, every Saturday, you know, that breaks down the relationships that exist between service providers, whether that be grassroots or statutory, and the young people and their families. And when referrals go through and people come in and it's all of a sudden, you know, you've got an appointment and you've got to do this and you've got to prove this, and what are your finances looking like, and why did your kid not go to school? And often the kid was ill, the young person needed a day off. You know, as adults, we talk about taking mental health days all the time. You know, if you're not up for going to school, if you've been affected in a certain type of way that you need time off, do it. But for children, they're not given those same graces. I think about what happened last week and the lynching that took place with Dear John being murdered. And for so many children, for so many adults, we were affected in a way where we were rocked to our core. Yet young people and adults alike were expected to go to school and to go to work and to act as if our world hadn't just been rocked down, and that the little boy who was murdered couldn't have been anybody's child, you know, who sits in this room today with a black or brown child. And it's funny because the young people that we work with will safeguard themselves so often, and they talk about their little brothers and their little sisters and never wanting them to have and face the circumstances that they face or that their parents faced. So bridging the gap is really important, because as youth workers, we are given the amazing opportunity to hold a position of trust. And that position of trust is one of the most important positions that anyone could hold, I believe, with a young person. You know, all the other adults in their life are people that get on their back or that ground them, and their mums, and, you know, you've got to be in. But we are able to hold really transparent and honest discussions with young people. And it's not about wrapping them up in cotton wool. It's about talking about action and consequence. It's about making them understand what the service's involvement means and what the consequences of their involvement can mean, and what not adhering to certain licence conditions can mean, or going visiting the girl that you're not supposed to visit can mean, and all of those things. But it's also about having open and honest discussions about the barriers that present themselves that are completely out of their control, like the stereotypes that exist around certain young people, whether that be what you look like, or the estates that you come from, or the families that you were born into. And this has to be done in a careful manner, because we're not there to put an opinion onto young people, but we're there to open their eyes to things that maybe they haven't had their eyes open to. So having discussions around things that have been discussed on the news, or books that have been published, and stuff like that. And like recently, Kill the Bill has been a huge campaign that we've seen hit Manchester. We've got a coalition that exists in the city, you know, and there's been, and resistance there is taking place in different forms, from outreach to protests to online events, from a whole myriad of different people and organisations. And young people now I've started to see from the social media online what it means, what the police crime and sentencing bill means, and what it brings in terms of the additional police powers and, you know, parole conditions, and the Priti Patel getting involved in active cases and stuff like that. And they're bringing these conversations up themselves. It's not, and when young people have asked social workers or other such people, they've not really been given an answer or the ability to discuss. So it's just about being there and being open and honest, I think, and maintaining dialogue. And also with honesty comes, if you haven't got an answer, tell the young person you haven't got an answer, because you don't lie to them, they see through it. We did when we was kids, so why would we do it now as adults?
Thank you, Zara. Going to open up to questions from those of you that are here and have been sent some through, some specifically about the book, but can also be more broadly to the panel. So to start with, bear with me while I scroll. Adam, in the book, you pay particular attention to Black women, both as victims of state violence, but also the importance of their role in resistance to British policing. So can you talk a little more about that experience and why you thought it was so important to centre there on the question of policing? And then I guess after that, I'll come to Zara and Asad on the same question about the importance of Black women in resistance to policing, as we see so many Black women take on fights for their mums, their sons, brothers, kind of family members, loved ones. And if you could reflect on that as well. But we will go to Adam first.
Sure. I just want to start by saying, thank you so much to Asad and Zara. It really means a lot for you to have such positive feedback on the book, and I really appreciate that you enjoyed it so much, especially as people involved in such important organising. So one of the things I noticed when, before I guess I started the research, when I first started going to an annual march called the UFFC March Against Deaths in Custody, which happens every year in October, led by the families of people who have died at the hands of the state, is that almost every single one of the campaigns against a Black death at the hands of the state was led by a woman, as you mentioned, Roxy, mainly family members. And I hadn't really seen anybody really writing about it, either kind of historically or today either. And I'm sure it had been written about in the kind of Black Power newspapers and the other places, that other resources you could find in the archives, but I hadn't really found a huge amount that was easily accessible. So I started interviewing people involved in these campaigns to ask them why do they think this is, and what effect do you think it has on our movements and our politics. And although there is of course no definitive answer, this is why it is that women lead all of these campaigns, and this is the definitive answer, this is why this is the effect that it has. There were a number of things that I thought were important that I noticed. So one of them, of course, is the fact that a lot of the political rhetoric around criminalization of Black communities is around the idea that their families are chaotic, neglectful places, right? The idea that there are all of these Black single parent families with these wayward mothers who can't raise a child on their own. And so I think that these kinds of racist narratives, which are used by both white politicians and journalists, but also by a lot of Black conservative politicians as well, and commentators, people like Tony Sewell and Sean Bailey and others, peddle this kind of discourse around the Black single parent family a lot as well. And I think so part of this activism, I think, is pushing back against these stereotypes to vividly illustrate how the Black family is a place of care, a place of solidarity, a place of safety. And so I think that's really crucial. But I think the second thing that it does as well is even more important, because what it does is it expands the notion of the family, right? It's not the notion of the family where it's this fixed kind of nuclear family unit with, two parents and some, 2.4 children. It's a more radical, expansive idea of the family, in which the family is expanded not just to kind of an extended family network of aunties and uncles and close family friends, but it's family articulated as community, and it's family articulated as resistance, right? So when the United Family and Friends campaign have their marches and their processions and do their resistance to state violence, they're articulating a vision of the family which extends beyond their biological networks, right? It's about building community resistance. And I think that's a really radical interpretation of the family that pushes back against these kinds of what we might call heteronormative ideals of the family as just being a man and a woman and some children, and thinks about it in a more expansive way as well. And I think thinking through these questions of gender were really crucial to better understand these kinds of anti-racist struggles.
Thank you, Adam. I don't know if anyone else, Asad or Zara, would like to kind of reflect on the importance of Black women in resistance to policing that you've seen in your organising.
I don't mind going.
Yeah, go for it.
You want to go, Zara, first?
Go on, Asad, and then we'll come to Zara.
maybe just to pick up something on that Adam said, which I think is really, really important. It's this notion of which was very much the approach, I think, of radical Black organisations, was what does family mean, and the notion of family being community. And it's interesting if you look at that whole period of from the 70s to the 80s, right through to the 90s, you see the campaigns that are run overwhelmingly are called family defense campaigns. They're family campaigns. They're campaigns. They don't say the name of the organ. I mean, like most, we always used to say as NMP, we never ran a campaign which had the word NMP at all in it. It was always the family campaign. You centered it on the family, but you built the family by building this broader sense of what the family was in terms of community. And then you weave together other campaigns that were family campaigns into bigger family campaigns. So sometimes people talk about, of course, look, there was a period of political black, but political black wasn't like an abstract term. It was created because of organizing. And so like as NMP, we had, the New Mates campaign running where young school children had been arrested and were being charged with a fray for defending themselves from a racist attack, and find out actually that the people who were perpetrated the racist attack were undercover police officers, and they were predominantly Asian. But at the same time, we had a murder of a young African Caribbean young man who was murdered by a notorious racist, and the police were basically criminalizing his brother, right? And were saying this is a gang fight, etc. And there was the Price family campaign and the New May. And they both ran campaigns, but they're both connected. They shared platforms, they mobilized together, and we wove together this idea of, again, of racism and policing, and underpinning all of that. And I think particularly in more modern Adam talks about deaths in custody. I've from my experience, both in terms of deaths in custody and particularly the war on terror, the people who held those campaigns together were overwhelmingly women in the families, in the broader family, because these were campaigns that were not short, right? They were not, well, we'll do something and in 3 months' time there will be. These were year upon year fights. I mean, the Menezes campaign, which was around after Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot dead at Stockwell Tube Station, that was overwhelmingly his cousins who were young women who were migrants in this country, and literally the state thought, they're uneducated, they're migrants, they're scared about the status, they will just turn a blind eye, we will send the body back, there'll be apology, etc. And for 10 long years, that family fought for justice, ultimately not successful in holding the individual police and Cressida Dick to account, but really did not allow Jean's death to go unnoticed, and ran an incredible campaign. That's not to say also that there weren't huge challenges, right? I mean, the anti-racist movement, and particularly amongst Black organizations, huge issue about patriarchy, and there were also always real debates and issues in terms of Black women saying, part of the Black movement is replicating what the white movement is doing to us, telling us class is the most important thing, race will be fought after once we've solved the class struggle, the race struggle will be automatic. And they'd say, but you're doing the same in terms of saying it's first class, race, and then gender, rather than actually approaching what today people would say as an intersectional approach. So I don't want to gloss over that it wasn't hugely challenging, but for Black radical women, but they were incredible, and they were actually at the forefront of so many of the Black organizations, not just the campaigns, but actually the investing in long-term effort into building community infrastructure. And those were not just about race and policing. If you look across the country, the organizations that were set up around, housing for the Black community, around education, around welfare, overwhelmingly Black women activists who'd come through in terms of radicalism around race and policing, also understood that fight wasn't possible without also understanding the crisis of economic and social injustice, and wove together a much bigger narrative than even I think some of the radical Black groups were trying to weave together. They actually located what we'd call Black revolution in a much more sort of holistic way. So I have to say, I'm politicized by Black women who, you know, who connected me to the broader struggle. And I think there was a whole generation where people were, you know, if they say, who gave you, not who told you about campaign, but who gave you your political education? People would say, it was this radical Black woman. They made time, they made effort, they taught us our history, they brought books and pamphlets, and they also like nurtured a generation of young activists and told us that's what we had to do to the next generation and the generation. So I think also they had a much better understanding of this struggle is like a generational struggle, and we have to equip our movement for each generation to come to learn the lessons, but also be equipped to fight. So, you know, I mean, now increasingly, thankfully, people are looking back and you know, and at least lauding some of the, and saying, you know, the Mangrove wasn't just about Darkus, you know, they're actually Black revolutionary women, you know, you know, even in the 80s, you know, of course, people know Diane Abbott as because of her being elected, but, you know, Martha Osmore and all of the other Black women who fought within the Labour Party for Black sections, and the Black women who fought within the trade union movement for Black self-organisation as well. I mean, you know, in the early 80s, there was a huge amount of Black organising, particularly in public sector unions, and a lot of those public sector unions were led by radical Black women, and they were the ones who were saying, actually, we're going to organise in cleaners, we're going to organise in the health service, we're all going to organise. And, you know, when there were big gatherings of Black activists, and the whole ecology of our movement was together, I would say, you know, some of the most inspiring and leading women, leading people were always came from Black struggle. But unfortunately, you know, we're always sort of, Black men often thrust themselves forward, right? And they became the faces of movements. And a lot of Black women did the heavy lifting of keeping the organizations going. I have to say, even in NMP's history, you know, without the commitment of many Black and brown women, we would not have survived 35 years of organizing.
Thank you so much. And Zara, there's of course all these incredible Black women that are leading campaigns and organizations and groups, but additionally, I think what I particularly see also on the ground, and I'm sure you do as well, is Black women, particularly mothers, fighting the everyday and resisting the everyday policing as well. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, thanks, Roxy. So I'd very much echo what Adam and Asad have already said around it. But I'd also say, like what Asad said, what is family? And I think white supremacist patriarchy has taught us that family is headed up by a man and a woman at the top. But in my family, when I think about my nana, she was the matriarch of the family, you know, she was the one who, I mean, everyone was scared of, let's be honest. And when I think about where I come from in Tonga, Indigenous, Oceanus Pacifica Indigenous, women stand at the top of the family hierarchy, so to speak. And I think that we see that echoed here in England and across the West, you know, that Black women are at the forefront of these fights, but it's looked at through a lens where it's not expected to be the case, you know, because they're women and of this gender divide that exists. And but my mentors over the years have been Black women who have said, nah, Zara, keep your accent, talk the way you talk, be as loud as you need to be, don't straighten your hair, wear your hoops, be you, be bold, be yourself, continue. You know, when I see that in the spaces now, as I enter professional spaces, it continues as I sit across tables as part of anti-racist movements on the ground organising, they continue to be at the forefront, but now also with the families that I work from, you know, and power is drawn from them. And I think in terms of resistance with the police, when the police want to tear your family apart and you gave life, you know, and you held dear and you fed and you clothed and you reared, there is nothing I don't think that you wouldn't do. And I think Black women have seen this happen over and over again, you know, throughout their lives, and they anticipate the day that they will have to step into that position. It's horrible to think that they prepare from childhood for the day where it may be them that has to sit at that table and fight for the rights of their child and their family. And now, even today, the friends that I speak with who are activists, who aren't activists, who have young children, and they wonder at what age will their baby go from being somebody that everyone's like, oh, look at his cute hair, to, oh, let's cross over the road, you know, and this is a constant battle that exists for Black women who are steadfast in the protection of their children and the family that they love and the communities that they come from, and the communities that at the end of the day have created the person that they've become in these positions.
Thank you, Zara. And as well as kind of recognising their role in resistance, I just, there's a good book, it's called Invisible No More. I've forgotten the author, but maybe Remy could look it up. So just like designating task to Remy there. But it speaks to, in an American context, the harms as well that Black women are subject to by the police that are so often invisibilized here too. And I think as we've done more work on police in schools, it's often young Black girls that we see subject to over-policing in their school environments. So yeah, just want to kind of touch on noting that book, and as well the harms that Black women are subject to as well. So back to some questions. So another question is, many in this room will be convinced by abolitionism arguments, but a sizable section of the British public are opposed to abolition. Is this important? If so, how can we clearly communicate to people that prisons and police do not make us safer? Going to come to Adam first, and then we'll come back around if anyone would like to add.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. So I guess maybe there's two or three things. I think the first is that, I guess I mentioned before that I feel like abolition is how this generation is articulating global revolution. And in the 1970s and 80s, most people weren't necessarily in favour of global revolution, but I think it was still important for grassroots movement to have that vision, right, of a different world, right? I think it's really important. But I think the second thing that's really crucial is that although a lot of people might not be in favour of prison and police abolition, when you present quite basic arguments, right, the basic facts that prison and police expansion hasn't made us any safer, costs us a huge amount of money, and brings more harm generally rather than less into the communities that it's supposed to bring safety to. And that actually it's far more fiscally responsible as well as morally responsible to actually invest in preventative measures of harm reduction, then a lot of people are actually really in favor of those kinds of arguments. And I think what makes those kinds of arguments difficult isn't necessarily people wanting to, pushing back against those kinds of arguments, but the real power of these moral panics, of the terrorist, of the gangster, of the immigrants, right? The real power of these moral panics, I think, is really what we're pushing up against. And the fact that actually the idea of the terrorist and the gangster and the immigrants aren't these threats aren't the greatest threats that your community is facing, or your society is facing, or that the country is facing, but are actually displacing the real threats to our safety, right? The safety that means that we're going to struggle to have a secure home, a decent job, a proper education, an environment and an environment that isn't crumbling around us, right? These are the things that are the threat to our safety and our livelihoods. And I think it's pushing back against these racisms, really, that I think is the greatest battle, more difficult, I think, than the quite clear evidence that police and prisons have failed what they say they're going to deliver, and are a way of taking working class people's tax money and putting it into forms of violence and coercion and harm.
Thank you. Asad, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all this generational thing about how you frame different moments and different analysis. And I always say, absolutely, each generation comes and understands this moment and uses language that makes sense to it and the movement. So absolutely, I think, you know, the term abolitionism speaks to the very tradition that we've all come from. I do sometimes wonder whether, you know, it's context in terms of the US and then bringing it to the UK, what that means in terms of, is it traveling? Because you need to do a lot more sort of deeper political education to make people understand what that actually means. But that's not to say that the vision or the principle is wrong. I mean, it was funny. I was just when Adam was talking, I just looked at the UK government civil service website, and the fact that, and they talk about the Glasgow knife crime, right? And I loved at the end they have this thing which says cure, not punishment, right? And so that's exactly what we're arguing, right? I mean, I think the question for me in terms of the movement is, how do you build the campaigns that are maybe reformist, but take people on the journey to understand what the final goal is, that we're not going to suddenly move from where we are now, as Adam says, to suddenly abolishing the police or the prison system. But there are fights on the way where we can amass people and begin to dismantle the system. And then we have to start to think about what does that dismantling the system look like and what are the right fights to have, which begin to do that. And that's how we always understood the state. It's why we always picked certain fights, why we understood what we were trying to do was, when we were talking about police accountability, we were not talking about multi-agency. We were talking about a fundamental transformation of the nature of policing and its relationship to working class and Black communities. But we understood that the fight was going to be about police accountability. And we would use that to make our arguments that actually the police was an arm of the state. Look at how policing was faced by Black people and working class white people, and try and draw and take people on a broader journey to start questioning, you know, why have we got super police stations, fortress police stations in every working class area? Why do we have 24-hour police on visible presence? What does that policing look like? Why doesn't it look the same in Hampstead? Why do they see and start to talk and begin to take, because there's an understanding that we as a community, as working class and poor Black, brown people, needed to be policed. We need to be contained, and we'd start people on that, and people would say, yeah, absolutely, I understand that. Actually, I connect with what you're saying. That's my experience. And suddenly you'd start, people would deepen their, to go on that journey with you, to begin to say, I now understand what you mean when you say the police are an arm of the state. And I think this is where, for me, the abolitionist movement is at the moment, is we have a vision, we have a goal, but now we have to think about what are the fights that build the power and the deepening of this understanding, so that it resonates with our community and we can build support within our community for it.
Thank you. Zara, did you want to add anything to that?
All I'd add onto what's been really well said already, is that most of the people that don't want to abolish anything aren't affected by the systems. So why would they? And I think what's central to all of the resistance campaigns and stuff that goes on is that our trauma and we're centered to the struggle, and that's why we're against it. Whereas if you're not, and you're not affected by it, and you're not oppressed by it, then you won't see the negative to it. And that's why grassroots organisations can do so much, is because that we're living it and we're taking that to the fight. Whereas people who have no lived experience and don't understand what it means to be oppressed by state violence don't have the understanding to fight against it or to want it to be dismantled.
Thank you. I'm gonna come to a final kind of question that is going to merge a few different questions, I guess, but take from it what you wish to, each of you. What historical lessons can we take for the present moment in terms of resistance? What resistance movements do we need to build moving forward? And I guess as well, are there only any resistance movements that are giving you hope right now? And just so people have had a break, Adam, I'm going to come back to you again to start off with.
Cool. Thanks so much. So maybe I'll answer the final question, if that's all right, about what resistance movements are giving me hope. And I would say that what's really giving me hope right at the moment, which is something Zara mentioned earlier, actually, is that Kill the Bill coalition. A comrade called Shanice from Sisters Uncut recently, I think, summed it up by saying that they made a really big mistake attacking us all at once. Because I've never seen a coalition of radical Black organizations, radical Muslim organizations, radical feminist organizations, radical Gypsy Roma traveler organizations, trade unionists, migrant solidarity groups, a whole wave of different organizations, not simply organizing against a specific piece of legislation, which is this bill the government are introducing, but also articulating a radical politics of abolitionism as well. And I think that, for me, that is really, and also radical youth groups as well are organizing with this. Groups like No More Exclusions and the Forefront Projects, I'm sure in London, and I'm sure others out in other parts of the country as well. And I think that bringing the fact that this government has been so arrogant to attack us all at once has necessitated this really amazing broad coalition. But also, I think that the mainstreaming of abolitionist politics over the last 18 months has better enabled the movement to say this goes beyond this legislation. This goes beyond these particular police and prison and border powers. And it needs to be, we need to resist this bill, but with a view to having a far more radical appraisal of state power. And for me, I've never seen anything like it in my relatively short lifetime. And I think for me, it brings hope that goes beyond anti-racism, it goes beyond policing, and it talks about a wider political working class radical movement for social change.
Thank you so much. And just seeing different people putting links or Twitter handles to their own work in the chat as well. So please do follow those. Asad, Zara, anything you would like to add about hope for you right now in resistance?
Absolutely. I think as revolutionaries, we've always got to be hopeful, right? That's what drives us, right? We do what we do because, you know, we love our communities and we love humanity, right? And we know that this is a lifelong commitment to what to the world we want to see. And there are ebbs and flows, and I have to say I've never been so hopeful as this moment, because exactly as Adam said, I look and I'm just blown away by the energy and the organizing of from Kill the Bill, BLM, even amongst the climate strikers. You look, it's Black and brown. It's lots and lots of young women, Black women, brown women at the forefront of these movements, bringing a really radical perspective and thing, changing the climate discourse from climate to climate colonialism, connecting Kill the Bill with this abolitionist, talking about Black Lives Matter, moving and talking about the historical colonial legacy of Britain. This is an incredible educative moment for the movement as a whole. And I saw it even, you know, a few weeks ago during the marches on Palestine. Because anybody went on any of those marches on Palestine, I'll tell you what the difference between that and marches I went on in the mid-'80s on Palestine. In the mid-'80s, you know, we would have like the traditional parts of the traditional white left on Palestine and some parts of the community, but not even that much of our community. Now it was overwhelmingly young, and it was diverse, it was militant, and it was young, Black, brown, and they were connecting their struggles. And it just reminded me of back in the 80s when we used to send Black delegations to Palestine, Black delegations to the north of Ireland, you know, to make connections with movements and communities in resistance, learning from each other, connecting our struggles, recognizing that our fight in this country was a fight that was a global fight. When I joined the Asian youth movement, we were told we're we fight racism here, we're anti-imperialists, we're anti-colonialists. The same fight we fight here is being fought in Southern Africa, in Mozambique, in South Africa, in Angola. It's been fought in Palestine. It's been fought, and we were internationalists and drew that and said that those were part and parcel of all of our connections. And I really feel that hopeful that not only are people looking at the nature of the British state, but putting the nature of the British state within the context of the global system of apartheid that we see. That's economic, that's racial, that's climate, that's COVID, and bringing the same lens and saying, this is the same politics that has been in play for 500 years. It's racialized capitalism, it's the sacrificing of Black and brown people, it's the sacrificing of working class people. And I think they're in a challenge because, as Adam says, capitalism always moves into moments of crisis, but it's in a crisis that it cannot recapitalize it like it did in the financial crisis. There's a big structural change going on. And if you look around the world, there are massive social protests going on all of the time. It was before COVID and during COVID. And I think after COVID, we're going to see another reckoning. And I'm much more hopeful that change is possible and that we have the movements with the right politics, the right organizing and the right vision to be able to make the most of this moment, because we've tried before and we've not been as successful as we wanted to be. But not to put pressure on you all, the younger activists, but you know, I have a lot more hope in all of you to bring the change that we've fought for.
Thank you. And Zara, any final words on what is making you hopeful right now? Any resistance movements making you hopeful right now?
I'll be really quick so we don't go over, but I've got to be hopeful. I work with young people every day. I'm involved with a lot of the young people, the younger activists across Manchester, and we're chasing, you know, and we're determined. And this next generation of young people that's on the come up now will not be tamed. They're unrelenting at their young ages now, so I can't wait to see them in the early 20s. And what's beautiful as well is that we've currently got young people who are there for the grassroots, and then we've got other ones who are stepping into those spaces of education and wanting to access political spaces, and within themselves as teenagers and young people are already organising what their adulthood would look like in terms of the struggle and following where their strengths and their skill sets sit, and working towards those goals. Always hopeful, always ready to, you know, work with the people who are willing to put the work in with us, and we will be dismantling white supremacy as it exists in this country, and we will, you know, be happy and safe, and safety is the aim, and that's what we're here for. And when the young people take over in the next couple of years and we can all sit back and enjoy, you know, some good food in our gardens, that'll be the day.
Thank you. And Andrea wrote in the chat, "We will win," which is something that is often said in our international police free schools meetings, which is always, yeah, really uplifting. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, Adam, Asad and Zara, for all your incredible contributions. Please go and buy Adam's book, which I believe the link has been shared, but I'm an awful plugger of stuff, so this is probably not helping. But yeah, Remy or someone will share the link in the chat, and please go and buy it and support there. Thank you to NPMP group members who've been organising behind the scenes as well. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today, and sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but importantly, thanks to everyone who has been part of and continues to be part of the resistance to British policing. It's been really great to see you all, and I'm sure we will do this all again soon. Never know how to close a Zoom meeting, but that's how we're going to do it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers, bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.